We are here today at the People's Forum, co-sponsoring Verso Books event, the book launch of Andrew Ross's book, Stone Men. Andrew Ross is a professor of social and cultural analysis at NYU and director of the American Studies program, a contributor to The Guardian, The New York Times, The Nation, and Al Jazeera. He is the author or editor of more than 20 books, including Creditocracy and the Case for Debt Refusal, Bird on Fire, Nice Work If You Can Get It, Fast Boat to China, No Collar, and The Celebration Chronicles. His new book, from Verso, is titled Stone Men, The Palestinians Who Built Israel. Today, he will be in conversation with Lamis Deek, who is a Palestinian attorney, strategist, and human rights advocate in private practice, and serves as chief counsel to the Global Justice and Human Rights Law Network, who's litigated Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim civil rights and criminal defense of terrorism charges, and internationally works on anti-corruption, human rights grievances, and complex litigation, regularly lectures on issues related to government surveillance, discrimination, and predatory policing, and racialized prosecution, and is now working to expand the international movement to end Israeli impunity. Lamis's work has been presented at several international expert and strategy meetings on Palestine, development, and refugees.
Hello, people. Thanks for coming. And thanks to my publisher, Verso. Wes House is here. He's in the house. Thank you. And before we begin, let's acknowledge that we are meeting here on occupied homelands of the Lenape people, and the fact of this occupation has some significance and resonance for the topic for this evening. So let me tell you a little bit about how I got to write this book, because it's by no means obvious. Really, the story begins 40 years ago. I spent a few months working in a kibbutz in Galilee, on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, kibbutz Ginosar. And it was a very turbulent moment to be there. The efforts to Judaize the Galilee, which is a long-standing campaign, had just been stepped up, so there was a lot of expropriation of land going on. And the most well-known member of the kibbutz, Yigal Allon, who some of you might know something about his history. He was the founder of the Palmach and military commander of Operation Broom during 1948, as in sweep away the residential population. Here he is addressing an assembly of Palestinian notables on the kibbutz. And in his memoirs, he actually used the phrase cleanse, as in to cleanse the Galilee. I was put to work in the grapefruit orchards. This is me 40 years ago. I was a hippie, as you can see. Actually, I still am a hippie. But sometimes they put me to work in the banana fields, and on one occasion I noticed at the end of the work shift a couple of men leaving the crew and walking towards the Tiberias Road, and they didn't have the loose-limbed swagger of a typical kibbutznik male, and I figured these must be Palestinian day laborers. And I thought I should ask them some questions. Who are you? Where do you live? How much are you paid here? How do you feel about working on land that has probably been stolen from your forefathers and foremothers? But I never got to ask the questions. I left to go and travel in Egypt shortly thereafter. And it really wasn't until 35 years later that I returned to the region at the invitation of some Palestinian friends who were making a film there. They wanted me to come and interview workers at checkpoints for the film. And we previously had been doing a lot of work in Abu Dhabi with migrant workers in the Gulf states, and I had been barred from entry there, and several of our comrades had also been barred from entry. So we turned our attention to Palestine, and we realized here we are talking to migrant workers in their own land. Related proposition, but also quite different altogether. And in the course of the interviews I was doing, I realized here I am finally asking the questions that I'd lightly formulated 35 years before. So I decided to spin this off and write a book, spin it off from the film and write a book on Palestinian labor. Now, why did I think this book was necessary? Well, there's not a whole lot of literature on Palestinian livelihoods, believe it or not. And from the point of view of international Palestine watchers, even the Solidarity movement, they're mostly focused on other things, right? Land theft, evictions, demolitions, human rights violations, soldier brutality, incarceration. Take your pick. And all for very good reasons. But there's not a lot of knowledge of and attention to what Palestinians do on a daily basis to put food on the table for their families. So that's one of the reasons I decided to write this book. In addition, I was kind of astonished to discover there isn't a single published study of the stone industry in the West Bank. Now, why is this astonishing? Because it's the largest private sector employer of Palestinians. It contributes the largest share of GDP, also the largest share of exports from the occupied territories. And for such a small population, Palestinians are the 12th largest stone producer in the world, behind the US and above Russia. And those of you, many of you probably know there are two resources in the West Bank that are in short supply in Israel. One is water, which Israelis and settlers siphon off using advanced pumping technologies from the mountain aquifer. The other is stone, and it is extraordinary stone. It's still largely under Palestinian ownership and control. This is a map of some of the West Bank stone deposits. They're all in the Central Highlands, and it's some of the best dolomitic limestone in the world. What happens to it once it's extracted? Some of it is used in the West Bank and Gaza. Some of it goes to neighboring countries in the region, but 75% of it goes inside the Green Line to Israel or to the settlements. Now, the irony of this, as you can imagine, is that the very contents of Palestinian land, the innards of Palestinian land, is being used to build out the Israeli state and the spreading archipelago of settlements in the West Bank. Now, Palestinians often refer to the stone as white oil because it's this precious resource. And as in other countries that depend upon oil, it's also a resource curse. The strip mining of it causes an enormous amount of environmental damage. It ravages the environment and sickens workers. It's largely unregulated. As far as our production chain goes, there's about 1,200 firms, quarries, factories, workshops, crushers, and from there, the stone moves from the quarries through the system across the Green Line to construction sites in Israel and the settlements for the most part. So I decided that I was going to interview the workers who follow the stone at every point of the chain, because there is this dual journey of labor and stone. The labor in the form of native skills and manpower. Here's the factories. Here's the workshops. Here's the checkpoints. Here's the construction sites on the other side. And also interview them coming back, because you get a different story from workers when they're coming back at the end of the day, sometimes in a great hurry to get through the checkpoints. And there's very little time left in a worker's day, because the day is basically from bed to work and from work to bed. There's hardly any time left in the day for anything else for these guys. I also did a lot of interviewing of workers who had to work in settlements, and in particular, those that lived in villages that were being encroached upon by the settlements and were in danger of losing losing the resources. The industry itself is mostly small family owners. The same names come up again and again. And that means it's undercapitalized, it's under-professionalized, and also under-regulated. And this is a different economy from, if those of you know about the famous Palestinian capitalists, like the elite circle, the crony circle around the Palestinian Authority, they don't get involved in this economy. That's comprador capitalism. This is a village-based economy that I call careful competition, because the families know each other for centuries. They very carefully compete with one another and coexist. There's a different kind of capitalism. There are unions. There's a workers' union in Beit Fajar, which is one of the big stone villages. I focused on that. It's a relatively weak union. And partly because overt forms of class conflict in Palestine are still somewhat frozen, that they are discouraged in the name of national unity, in the name of anti-colonial national unity. Palestine's basic law, for example, embeds the principles of a free market economy. There's no other country in the world that I know of that actually does that, that has a free market economy as its sort of constitutional operating economic principle. There's a number of new unions in the West Bank. I mean, Palestinian labor history is very rich and varied and not at all unified and quite fragmented, but a number of new unions have sprung up independent of the orbit around the Palestinian Authority. And also in Israel, there are some new unions too. That operate in a similar way, and there's a kind of sporadic and informal cooperation across the Green Line between these. Can't be too visible because it's not, it's discouraged, but it has produced a few results. This is the first, where we are. These are workers in a settlement industrial zone voting for the first union contract in a settlement industrial zone. And also there have been some gains inside Israel. I will mention this image is of extraction in a quarry, and you notice it's mechanized, but it's still pretty labor intensive. Palestinian producers are not allowed to use explosives, and this puts them at a considerable disadvantage when they're competing with producers in other countries, and also with a handful of Israeli-owned crushing facilities in Area C. The owners, well, typically after I interviewed owners, they would invite me back to their homes. And they would be fairly lavish hilltop mansions. And I'd be invited inside for an hour or so of Palestinian hospitality. But the purpose of the visit was not just hospitality, but also to advertise the wealth of the owners to me as part of our interview. So the owners are doing quite well, it has to be said, many of them, at least compared to the workers. In a lot of my interviews, I couldn't obviously avoid hearing testimony about the psychology of humiliation. Working for the occupier. This is a business that largely produces for and builds for the occupiers. So there's a lot of humiliation involved in this. Has its own impact upon profiles of masculinity. This is a profoundly masculine trade, male breadwinners. And particularly evident among workers who work in the settlements or those who actually labor on the separation wall itself. Many West Bank Palestinians have to work on the wall. And every so often, someone I was interviewing tried to summarize the situation, and some of them did it quite well. Here's one example I picked out. We build their houses while they demolish our homes. And note the distinction here between houses and homes, right? The Israelis are having houses built while our homes, Palestinians' homes, are being demolished. There was a lot of material in my interviews about, how the workers felt about their situation, how they felt about the occupation, how they felt about the Palestinian Authority, not very highly, and also about how their livelihoods have been tossed around as colonial bargaining chips. And this, for those of you who know about this is the policy of economic pacification in Israel, is that you are issued work permits to come and work in Israel in return for keeping the peace. So it's very much a trade, and if you misbehave and you act up and one of your relatives ends up in prison, then you won't be able to work. Your permit gets withdrawn. That said, I was just as interested in documenting the daily routines of these workers, what they do on a daily basis, the daily grind. And I was very struck again and again and again by the resilience. How, through thick and thin, in spite of all the obstacles and indignities thrown in their path, they are always there. They always show up in that production chain for work. And it's this sort of resolute will to show up for work, which I felt in some way reflected the resistance philosophy of sumud, which is steadfastness. The remnants of the craft of stonemasonry is what the stone industry is structured around. And it's a very ancient craft for Palestinians. Palestinian stonemasons are much venerated and sought out for their superior artisanal skills for centuries. Every large village had a master mason who designed and built and passed on knowledge to each generation. And this is an example of architecture without architects. This is what they do. Without any professional training, these masons basically built everything. They built hilltop villages. This is Abwain, just below Rawabi. This is Bir Zayt. They built township cores like Bir Zayt. And from the mid-19th century, they got in the business of city building. They built cities. This is Jaffa. They built Bethlehem, they built Nablus, they built Hebron, they built Haifa, they built Jerusalem, and eventually they built Tel Aviv, the first Hebrew city. Beginning in the 1960s, they went overseas, as it were, to build new nation states. This is Amman in Jordan. They built Amman. They also built post-colonial Gulf states when these Gulf states needed their labor and their expertise. And this was the workforce. The Palestinian workforce built these states before it was replaced by South Asian migrant workforce, which we had been studying previously. So I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that Palestinians have built almost every state in the region, except for their own. And of course, that includes Israel. Because part of my book tries to answer the question, who built Israel? And in the public mind, the given wisdom, of course, is that Jewish settlers and pioneers built Israel. They were unused to manual labor, they learned on the job, they staffed the cement mixers, they balanced bricks awkwardly on their shoulders, and they made new Jews of themselves through this nation-making toil, according to the doctrine of labor Zionism. Now, if you leave aside a lot of this Zionist mythology, you find that the labor part of this story is actually quite murky. And for a long time was obscured by the agrarian romance of the kibbutz, the communalistic kibbutz. And the economic origins of the kibbutz lay in the quest of Jewish settlers to try to extract a European standard of living from a Middle Eastern agricultural livelihood. How do you do that? And the solution was a kibbutz, which involves pooled resources. The pooling of resources on a communal basis provided a sustainable economy to do that, right? And that was in rural areas. In the urban sector, even more difficult, however, because Jewish settlers, many of them were socialists. They demanded their labor rights. They demanded a European wage as opposed to an Arab wage, which is a local market wage. And they got it. How did they get that wage? They got it through World Zionist funding. World Zionist funding was used to top up the wage to a European level. And this is the origin. This happened in the 1910s, 1920s. But this is the origin of a long, enduring pattern of World Zionist subsidies for Israeli political development, economic development rather, which continues to this day. There was also the famous or infamous conquest of labor, which was a campaign that put pressure on Jewish and foreign employers to exclude Arabs from their workforce. And there was a lot of sound and fury around it, but it was only partially successful, I think. Why? Because employers have always preferred Palestinian Arab labor, then and now. And there's lots of reasons why they would have preferred it then. They were cheaper, they were better, they had less strident labor politics, and they had generations of construction experience in the region. Why wouldn't you prefer that kind of workforce? Let me give you an example of how it played out. In one case study, what I call the Battle of Tel Aviv. In Tel Aviv, the local stone it's not limestone, which it is in the West Bank, it's sandstone. It's called kurkar. It's lithified sand dunes, basically. And the stonemasons of Jaffa had worked with this stone for centuries and worked very well with it. And when World Zionist funders wanted to make this new settlement of Tel Aviv, they demanded that the workforce to build Tel Aviv would be Arab-free. It would only be built with Jewish hands. And that was almost impossible to do because Jaffa at the time was 100,000 people. It was reduced to 4,000 after the Nakba. That's the level of reduction of population. But the stonemasons of Jaffa were in a very, very strong labor position. And excluding them from the workforce would cause all sorts of conflicts. So the decision makers in Tel Aviv decided to look for a technological solution. They devised silicate bricks, and then they started using cement and concrete, materials that meant they didn't have to rely on the Palestinian stonemasons. And these are materials that were deemed to be easier to use by the less skilled Jewish hands. Concrete developed into a cult in Israel. It became the signature mark of Israeli modernity after the Nakba. And today, the march of concrete across the West Bank is the brand mark, the repellent brand mark of the occupation itself. But remember, as I said earlier, the original decision to use the concrete was to exclude Palestinians from the workforce. Now, after 48, there was an effort to do what I call architectural cleansing, which meant to physically eradicate all of the remnants, all evidence of Ottoman-built heritage in the portion of the land that was now called Israel. That involved not just the demolition of villages, but also the makeover of urban quarters. And that flight of Zionism away from the built heritage of the region came to a halt in 1967. After the occupation of the Old City in Jerusalem, and with the work of the Israeli biblical archaeologists, what happened was that Israelis began to see old stones of Palestine through new eyes. They were no longer the crumbling remnants of a backward civilization, right, to be demolished and gotten rid of. They were now seen as sort of magical pathways to the landscape of Jewish antiquity. So they were seen through completely new eyes, and this was driven by religion. On the one hand, there was also a more secular movement driven by real estate value. Old stone began to have an immense amount of real estate value, and the appetite for that value, and we can see this all over the world, right? This is how gentrification is driven by an appetite for old things, old decor, and crumbling facades, and so on and so forth. So what had been shunned, you know, previously, just 10 years before, was now highly prized. And by the time I got to, along with a lot of features of Ottoman architecture, arabesques and the like, which are fetching high real estate value. This is something I call Ottomania in the book, kind of appetite for all things Ottomanian. And it reached fever pitch by the time I got to Jaffa and started reporting in 2015. Some of the old buildings there on the edge of the old city were fetching the highest real estate prices in Israel, which is just astonishing. If you consider what had been happening previously. In addition, lo and behold, Kurkar, the stone that had been shunned a century earlier, was now in hot demand, along with workers who were few and far between, but workers who knew how to work with Kurkar. And they didn't know really all that well. In fact, this wall they were building around the old French hospital fell down, had to be rebuilt. So the skills had to be relearned. Now, the other part of this story is in the West Bank. If you go 25 kilometers from Jaffa, in the West Bank, you find there's also a lot of restoration of vintage stone and mortar buildings going on. But it's not being driven by real estate value. These buildings don't have a lot of market value, at least not yet, in the West Bank. It's being driven by political factors. The need to retain land, the need for bulwarks against settlers. They're evidence of long-standing Palestinian residence on the land. And some the folks I interviewed referred to them as Palestinian facts on the land, on the ground. And they might also be feeding into food security because it's largely a rural revival. So I study these three organizations. Each of them do architectural restoration. And they're in different places, so they do different kinds of work. And here's just one example. This is Jabba village, east of Jerusalem. This is before, and this is after. And quite a transformation. In addition, this work of restoration involves reclaiming old masonry skills and training workers in these old skills. Some of them are old-timers who still have the knack, and some of them are younger who are learning the skills from the old-timers. So I'm going to try and wind up now and just say that my review, and this is a historical part of the book, my review of the employment history of the construction industry shows that Palestinians have always been involved in the construction industry, in Israel, in every part of historic Palestine, from the Ottoman period through the British Mandate, when there was a long wave of economic expansion. After the Nakba, when a lot of Palestinians who remained inside Israel, who survived, had to build houses to accommodate each wave of incoming Jewish settlers. And after 1967, when this reservoir of cheap labor opened up in the West Bank and Gaza, through thick and thin, Israeli employers have always found it difficult to shake off their dependency on Palestinian workers. And today, they're at a numerical height. The number of West Bank workers employed in Israel and the settlements, with or without permits, is greater in number than ever before. And this is despite all these efforts to replace them over the years. There's an effort to replace them with Mizrahi Jews after the Nakba. And then again, after the first Intifada, as a collective punishment, this effort to bring in migrant workers to Israel from overseas. There's only one period I found that you could really say that the construction workforce was Arab-free, and that was after 1948, and it didn't last very long. Palestinians in Israel were under military lockdown. It's almost impossible for them to leave villages during that period. But after a few years, in fact, maybe even after a few months, they could be found once again working in construction sites. So what are the claims that arise from this? What claims and what rights accrue from this century or more of toil? From this century of sweat equity? What does that get you, all that labor? How can it translate into rights? This is a question I kind of lay on the table in the book. And in addition, what additional restitution is due to a population that was fashioned into a compulsory workforce after 1948 and 1967. We're not talking about forced labor here, right? But we're not talking about free labor. It's what I call a compulsory workforce because there were no alternatives. And by design, there was no alternatives. The alternative is a starvation wage for many of these workers. They can't survive. They have to do this work. That's what makes it a compulsory workforce. How can this inventory of labor feed into the debate now about a single state, a unitary state, with civil and political rights for everyone? If and when a final status, the negotiations for final status or permanent settlement start up again, and I hope Lamis has a lot to say about this. She's an expert in some of these issues. When that happens, if and when that happens, it is a big if, all the old claims will still be on the table, right? Claims for lost property, restitution of lost property from the Nakba onwards, compensation for moral suffering, and of course the right of return. All of these are debts from the past that have to be repaid. But what about the future? What about rights in the future in the successor state, the single state? That is where, at least I make the argument, that the labor-based remedies come into play based on this principle that if you build a country, this translates into earning political rights within that country. Has that worked elsewhere in the world? This is one question. The evidence is that it's been very difficult for bonded, indentured, enslaved, and ethnically persecuted immigrant workforces who've generally done that work in developed countries to get any kind of state-level recognition for their rights as a result of their labor, right? If you look at the US, the hard labor of African Americans and Chinese and Irish and Mexicans and other immigrant workforces hasn't been easy to use this argument. Hasn't translated into inclusion in the same way. There was a promise for 40 acres and a mule, and that was not kept, if you remember. That's one example I can think of. But for the most part, it hasn't worked out. However, I do think that the moral force of this argument has translated over time into civic and legal acceptance and full inclusion of these laboring populations. And these are populations that were brought here or came here, not always willingly, from somewhere else. In the case of Palestine, we're not talking about such a population. We're talking about people who are building on their own land, on their own ancestral land. So there's an even stronger case to be made, I think, for the sweat equity to translate into rights. I'm going to leave you with one quote from this fellow who was at a checkpoint and he was waiting to go across. And he said to me, I've been building homes every day over there for 30 years. In a way, it's really my country too, isn't it? And I think that kind of sums it up very nicely. I mean, much more eloquently than, what I've been describing with $25 words. So I'm gonna leave you with that to think about. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, for your work and that brilliant presentation. I'm going to be a little bit less dynamic. I'm going to sit because I'm so tired. I'm probably cross-eyed at this point. And, this is a little less prepared than I would normally be because when I make the time for this, I have a goal or an ask of people. Hold on. And my ask right now is, how do I get this on here? There we go. If I could figure that out, I could figure anything else out. So, we're actually at a very critical time in world history, not just in Palestinian history. And I think everybody sees, what's being called almost in a silly way, this extreme bipartisan split is really a manifestation of the, stark polarization that we're seeing happen all over the world. Zionists, fascists, neo-Nazis, the hard right wing, the climate change deniers on one end, and those who are fighting for Black lives, who are fighting for clean air and clean water, clean soil, and Palestine, and justice, and humanity, and for human and global morality on the other end. And Palestine is increasingly rising to the top of that pole that seeks justice. And what that means is, fortunately, we have a mushrooming movement in solidarity with the Palestinian struggle for liberation and return, right? But that also means that a lot of forces are going to be very heavily invested in what our liberation and return looks like, and very heavily committed to dictating the boundaries and the circumference of our liberation and return. And we are, as Andrew said, not always able to articulate all of the damages that we suffer, all of the issues, and I'm going to touch on a few of them that I don't know whether they're mentioned in the book, and I haven't read it yet, but I'm eager to. Because we are a community, Palestinians and our supporters, we're a community in crisis, which means that we're constantly responding to violence, right? And the violence is everywhere. Right? It's not just in Palestine, it's in Lebanon and Syria and in the US in lawfare and repression and arrests, and it's ongoing, it hasn't stopped, right? So, but I ask that as we can maybe relegate some of the work to manage that crisis, and you'll notice I'm looking at my people, the young people leading the movement in this room, that as we rush to manage the crises, that we don't lose sight of really what it means to develop a more I hate to use the term sophisticated, but you know what I mean, because I'm tired and I can't think of another word, a more sophisticated and thorough narrative of what our demands are, and to be able to articulate it. Because the Zionist and pro-Zionist agenda has specifically asked and demanded that not only we refrain from doing that, but that nobody hears us finish the sentence of what we want. So that's my goal tonight. All hands on deck, and prepare, right? Not just offensive strategies, but really have an idea taking. And this is why I think Andrew's work is so critical. The crimes committed by the Zionists are some of the best documented, actually, on Earth. But their incorporation into the work and their publication is the least documented and the least proliferated on Earth. And so we need to start preparing and making actual calculations, political, mathematical, financial, for distributive purposes. So that's my message, is all hands on deck. So why are Israeli crimes of the early part of the century, Zionist crimes of the early part of the century, the best documented on Earth? Because at the time that Israel came into existence, and as the Zionists were escalating their crimes, was also the same time that the United Nations was forming, and we were watching these mandates to decolonize the rest of the world, right? While there was a mandate to essentially colonize Palestine. And so Palestine, unlike most other conflicts, unlike most other wars and colonizations, was assigned quite a number of institutions, specifically of the UN, to try to resolve this, because this was before the US had come into imperial power and before the US was racing to take the reins of Europe and Britain, which happened in the 1950s. And in fact, the US was one of the members of the UNCCP. I forget what the acronym stands for. I want to say the UN Commission on Conciliation for Palestine. And that committee, tasked with the US, France, I want to say Turkey, I recall which other state, was responsible for documenting the number of Palestinian refugees, documenting their grievances, and in fact was also tasked with trying to get some of their money released from Zionists and Israelis, right? I mean, this is a committee, can you imagine, that the US was involved in the 1950s. This is how different the US's position. So we have that. And then we have UNRWA, which has a record, a very clear record, not just of the refugees, but of all of their complaints, and this is well documented. And this is, in large part, I assure you, why the US and Israel want to shut it down and hopefully take over these records. And then you also had the ICRC, the Red Crescent, right? The International Red Crescent operating in Palestine, which had, UNRWA and ICRC had actual testimonies. And this is where I'd like to begin. Because before, there was this sort of exploited labor. And when I say exploited, to give you some context, we know all the justified outrage at the fact that in the US Constitution, a black person is listed as being 3/5 of a human being as compared to a white person. Well, in Israeli labor practices, a Palestinian is actually treated mathematically as 1/2 a person as an Israeli is. 1/2, okay? Well, before we got to this actually rather advanced stage of extremely exploited labor, what we had in Palestine, and what is unfortunately not published, though well documented by ICRC and by the brilliant, I urge everybody to pick up a book, find it, read him, Salman Abu Sitta, who will not only be remembered as the father of return, but the father of real liberation and nation rebuilding and integration for Palestine. Because what he did is he was able to pluck out all the documents that said that before there was labor exploitation by Israelis, there was actually labor slavery by Israelis of Palestinians. There were 5 registered camps registered with the ICRC, one of which was dedicated solely to slave Palestinian labor. And what did that labor entail? Precisely what Andrew was discussing, which is building Israel. Paving roads, building trenches, transporting materials, and working in the quarries, as Andrew mentioned. Burying bodies, burying Palestinian bodies, of course, and transporting the goods that Zionists had looted from Palestinian homes and distributing them amongst Israelis and the military, if you will. And that was the beginning of the relationship of labor between Palestinians and Israelis. And, and this is not a slight at Andrew, and not everybody that was involved in the kibbutzes really knew, and there are actually a couple of people here who have experience on kibbutzes. But the Palestinians who were kept in these camps, right, there were 5 registered camps, 17 quote-unquote unregistered camps, 22 throughout Palestine at the time. Now, by that time, we're talking about 1948 through 1955. So by 1948, 2/3 of the Palestinian population had been exiled or murdered, ethnically cleansed, in summary, leaving about 250,000 Palestinians. Of those 250,000 Palestinians, at least 12,000 were interned in camps. That's approximately 5% of the total population, all of whom are men. So you're looking at the majority of men from each of those towns. Boys from the age of 15 to men the age of 55 were held as captives of war and combatants. However, there were people much older than that and children much younger. It was just those who were treated as enemy combatants and treated with extra violence. The ICRC had lobbied for about a year before they were able to get a lot of those prisoners released. And what happened when they were released is they were permanently exiled. So they were enslaved and then permanently exiled. The ones who remained in the camps were not released until 1955. And as they were released, for some of you who know, if you remember the film The Kufr Qasim Massacre, around the time that they were released was also around the same time that the Israelis relaunched a series of massacres in those very same areas in which those camps were. On one night, they had massacred, I want to say 12 towns. One of those, October 1956, that same week. The most famous one is the Kufr Qasim Massacre because it was the only one that was memorialized. We still don't know all of the details of the massacre of the other 11 towns and villages that were nearby. So this is the context and really should frame our understanding of labor relations in Palestine under Israeli control, that everything that has developed or have been structural and institutionalized by Israel comes from and is born from this ideology, this relationship, this psychological dynamic, and this power dynamic, right? And so to this day, as I'm sure Andrew puts in his book, there's actually a list of labor based on race and ethnic identity that's produced by Israel. So Arab workers, no matter who comes in after them, are always the least paid. And like I said, we're number one, too busy, but number two, there's also a very strong investment in the erasure, not just of the ongoing crimes and the historic crimes that Palestinians have suffered, but there's an investment in censoring our demands. And that's because our demands are really very, very peaceful and strongly supported by law. What the Zionist narrative is that Palestinians, the Zionist narrative, being not just the Israeli narrative, by the way. And there is the Zionist narrative, which I think we have to be honest about and we have to discuss openly. The very right-wing Israeli narrative, which talks about, there was this video leaked, and I mean, I had always heard this back home, but actually talks about the belief that the whole point of Israel coming into being is that the Arabs would be made into slaves. So this is not an unusual narrative that is openly discussed by very hardcore Zionists. And we have to be honest that this happens, right? Because again, this also shapes what the perspective is of all of these, again, more ultra right-wing Zionists, but it's also something that's perpetuated in schools in Israel, right? In public schools or religious schools in Israel, which are funded by the state. And so all of this is erased because all they want you to know, and we are, is that Palestinians are angry and they are violent. Well, yes, we have to violently protect ourselves and we are angry because we're not allowed to complete the first or the last part of the sentence, which is we have been and we continue to be injured. Therefore, we are angry and will defend ourselves by any means necessary. And what we ask for so that we don't have to do this is justice in law so that we can all live in peace. And the rest of that is erased because the law is on our side. For over 4,000 years, there has been a codification of this basic common sense without which there would be absolute upheaval, right to leave your home and return to it. There has also been for almost 4,000 years, a codification of the right of a person who is injured to reparations and restitution. And this is how peace is kept. This is how you preempt retaliatory violence, right? And so this is where our demands and our work needs to go as a inseparable three-part demand for return with reparations, with restitution. And there's a slight distinction and there's, an overlap in terms. I don't want to bore you too much, but I do think that I should talk about some of the regulations and laws, right? So Palestine was the most addressed issue. I think it continues to be one of the most addressed issues in the UN, but certainly at the initiation of the UN, it was the most pressing issue, right? It was an ongoing ethnic cleansing, violent. The League of Arab States in 1948 even had actually petitioned the UN General Assembly, had posed a resolution for the UN General Assembly. Can you imagine if this had happened? To investigate Israel for war crimes and to try to prevent them, right? And the UN General Assembly had refused. And had they not had refused, I think we would be in very different conditions, not just in Palestine, but globally. And if you want me to explain how, I can do that later. But the whole world would be very different than we know it to be now. At the same time, resolution after resolution was being proliferated and signed and passed by various agencies, and not just the General Assembly. And the one that everybody knows is Resolution 194, right? UN General Assembly Resolution 194. Well, GA Resolution 194 doesn't just give us the right to return. No, to the contrary. It specifically gives two options to Palestinians, right? And these options are, again, just another articulation of all of the laws that existed previously, including the UN Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, right? Which said that Palestinians have the right to return, restitution, and reparations, or they have the right to resettlement and restitution and reparations. In both of these is the term and, right? Now, Palestinians say, we want to return. You've never seen a Palestinian say, I'm waiving my right to return. And in fact, this is a huge internal gripe or grievance that Palestinians have with the Palestinian Authority in the post-Oslo Palestinian governance. There's also UN Security Council Resolution 237, which was passed in 1967, which also says that Palestinians have the right to all three of those things, right? Very basic. Now, the distinction and why restitution, reparations, and return. I mean, I won't go into return. You've probably heard me talk about that a million times. But restitution, compensation, reparations. First of all, this is not just a duty that's owed to the victims, right? The idea of restitution and reparations is a duty that the actor, that the criminal actor or the perpetrator owes to society at large, right? Because if they are liable or guilty enough to be liable for restitution and reparations, they may commit these crimes or these actions again. So it is a duty owed to society, first and foremost. With the payment, the demand of payment, and restitution and reparations law are actually developed, unfortunately, largely in the civil context, right? The ICJ, the International Court of Justice, which gives advisory opinions, usually on labor-related cases, in fact, discusses this. And of course, there has been a trend, especially from European and European nations and the US, to limit what restitution and reparations look like. But in the context of grave war crimes and war crimes against humanity, as Israeli crimes and Zionist crimes are and will be labeled, I'm sure, there are certain things that are immutable and cannot really be compromised. And the essence, so there's this one duty that you have to promise, you have to feel bad enough and pay enough to know that you cannot and we will not accept a repetition of these actions. And there has to be a wiping out of the structures and the gains that came from those crimes and that led to the institutionalization of segregation or ethno-religious supremacy, right? So the point of reparations is to dismantle the structures and institutions born from violence and grave injustices. This, in and of itself alone, the application of this law would resolve every grievance of every Palestinian in the world, peace like this tomorrow. And that is why they don't want us to finish the sentence and they fill it in for us. They say, well, we want to drive all Jews into the river, right? That's what they say when we say river to the sea, Palestine will be free. No, what we mean when we say river to the sea, Palestine will be free is that we don't want on any land in the world, and certainly on Palestinian land, structures and institutions of and for the violence, because that's what this is. And if you read Andrew's book, and you'll see how tremendously violent, because we went from slave labor to actually conditions of slavery. And this is all also mapped out. This is very violent. There should be no safe haven for these institutions anywhere on the face of this earth. And that's what reparations really works and should work to accomplish. Restitution is a more individualized relationship. Restitution is what really prevents the individual desire for retaliation, right? The legacy that you have stolen from me, the psychological damage, the trauma that me and my children and my great-grandchildren have suffered, right? This needs to be remedied, right? And that's where restitution comes in, and it's a more mathematical formula. So reparations would look at things, not only just the institutions, but would look at the theft of gross domestic product, right? The prohibition of expansion of the economy, if you will, or Palestinian industry. And Israel has undertaken what seem almost like some of the silliest policies and practices to inhibit Palestinian industry. There's a film, I forget what it's called, somebody in here might remember, about Israelis who raided a town and put it under curfew because Palestinians brought in 8 cows so they can have their own milk and not have to buy Israeli milk. This is just one tiny example of the lengths that Israelis have gone to inhibit Palestinian industry. And by industry, I don't mean like industrial, but industry as in innovation and creativity and self-sustenance, right? So this is addressed in reparations. And just one last point on reparations. It's estimated that approximately 85% of the Israeli GDP is taken by direct theft. By direct theft, I'm talking about the destruction. That is not including the labor under conditions of slavery that Andrew is addressing, and all of the other ways that Israel indirectly steals from Palestinians. That's reparations. Restitution is the more one-on-one, and there's compensation, which is what are my pecuniary out-of-pocket costs for whatever it is. And this is the whole sentence, right? We were and we are injured. We are angry, and we demand return, reparations, and restitution. And everybody, even the Zionist criminals, upon reparations, restitution, and return, could live together in peace. That's how peace is maintained. But they don't want us to finish that sentence because it does a disservice to the narrative of the angry, violent, the anti-Muslim, Islamophobic, anti-Palestinian narrative that not only sustains Israel, but also sustains U.S. imperial interests and domination of the Arab region as a whole. So this is what I hope we will add to our demands. This is really the formula for peace. This needs to be normalized. What we're seeing happen, throughout the world, and as Palestine rises to Congress and to Parliament in the UK, the two-state solution, and nobody is talking about the repatriation of Palestinians and exacting real justice. Otherwise, we've entrenched, this is what a binational state is, or a two-state solution is. You're entrenching segregation, ethnic segregation. I mean, this is unheard of. Who would ever think that this is a palpable, acceptable model? Just a couple of models, I think Andrew asked. Let me know when I should wrap up, Nirdine. Okay, so, just a couple of models, because it's fine to look at history, and I think it's important to look at other examples, and Andrew is right. There haven't been any great examples, certainly not as of late. But, the great thing about the Palestinian movement and the Palestinian condition is that we are free of an administrative layer that imposes upon us restrictive frameworks within which we should operate. Our movements decide the frameworks of our liberation, our narrative, and therefore the policies that we will push to have implemented, which brings your job, our job, makes it all the more important, actually, right? So in the absence of this administrative layer, that means that we can look at the examples and see how we can make them better for everybody involved. A couple to keep in mind. The example of Bosnia. In Bosnia, they wanted to dismantle the religious segregation that was caused by the conflict. And in order to do that, what they said was that restitution is conditioned upon return. Now, I think that's, some people found that impressive. I think that that's a brilliant tool for dismantling segregation or ethno-racial apartheid. I mean, it would continue to be a system of that because the population is not allowed to access and is not restored, certainly if they're not choosing to be resettled, right? So restitution or reparations conditioned upon return, right? That was the Bosnian example.